I want to welcome everyone to this webinar this evening. This is the 5th of 11 webinars in our winter learning series that the Missouri River Bird Observatory is hosting in partnership with the Missouri Birding Society and the Conservation Federation of Missouri. Here at, my name is Dana Ripper. We also have with us this evening Ethan Duke. We are from the Missouri River Bird Observatory, and our mission is the conservation of birds and all wildlife and their habitats via science, education, and advocacy. We are really excited to host Eric and Joanna Reuter this evening for this very unique presentation about birds in big numbers, cause for celebration or concern. This presentation this evening is about the inspiration from massive flocks of birds. And Eric and Joanna write, although much has been made of birds in decline, some species can be present in large, even overwhelming numbers. We've become increasingly fascinated by the lure of seeking out and observing such concentrations in Missouri, and we'll draw on eBird and other data sources to explore common examples, including blackbirds, geese, and swans. We'll also discuss some complex issues raised by this topic, including how agriculture may influence both successful and struggling species. So Eric and Joanna Reuter are avid birders with professional backgrounds in earth science, education, communication, and organic agriculture, and deep personal interests in ecology, land management, and history. Active members of the Columbia Audubon Society, Eric and Joanna are also the creators of the YouTube channel Ozark Outsider, which explores geologic, ecologic, and human influences on the regional landscape. So Eric and Joanna, we're so pleased to have you. Please take it away, and thanks for the awesome video.
Thanks so much. We're really excited to be here. All right, so birders often do this funny thing. Some poor, obscure bird will get really terribly lost, and a birder will find it, and more birders will flock in to see it. This isn't so much birds in big numbers as birders in big numbers. So this is the kind of activity that appeals to a certain dedicated group of people who have already fallen head over heels in love with birds. But what sort of bird watching experience might be most likely to capture the interest of a broader group of people? People with busy lives who might be kind of interested in the outdoors, but are perhaps a little bit intimidated by birders. So that's the question that was on our minds back in 2019, when Eric and I were serving as the field trip chair and the newsletter editor for the Columbia Audubon Society. And I was looking for a way to gently exercise some of my data analysis skills. And so one day, while I was browsing eBird, a button that I had not previously paid much attention to just jumped out at me. High counts. And a light bulb went off. We could use eBird data to try to understand when and where birds concentrate in big groups. And well, maybe then we could plan some field trips that would enhance the statistical odds of getting people to see these big groups of birds. And that would be cool because lots of birds in one place can be really exciting to watch, whether you're an experienced birder or a new one. And you might not even need binoculars or binocular skills to enjoy the spectacle. But to do this, we needed to answer some questions. Which species flock in big numbers? When and where do these congregate? And are these congregations predictable? Are they predictable enough to schedule a field trip? So I started researching and writing some articles for the Columbia Audubon Society newsletter. So on broadwing hawks and blackbirds and starlings and overwintering trumpeter swans. That wasn't originally part of the series, but the population is grown enough. I think it retroactively qualifies. And most recently on snow geese. So at least one thing came out of this. We found a really large blackbird roost that was unknown to the birding community. So tonight we want to talk about some of these concentrations of birds, including when and where and how to see them. But we also want to step back and think about the big picture. What is the moral of the story, so to speak? Is it this? That big bird concentrations give us a glimpse of wild nature, a look back into the pristine wonders that must have been the norm before people started interfering with nature, the landscape, and the climate? Or is it actually really complicated? Maybe even a can of worms. So, to kind of give away the punchline, we think this topic raises a lot of very complicated questions about human interactions with the ecosystem. And as we talk about this tonight, we're going to say some things that might be a little provocative, and that's intentional. So, we're going to align our talk with a few cards selected from the really wonderful birding game Wingspan. Oh, except they didn't have a snow goose card, so we'll have to make do with a Canada goose card with the word Canada crossed out and the word snow written in crayon. So these birds are just a few examples of the ones that flock and congregate in big numbers. As we talk about these, we're going to be raising some interesting and challenging questions that come up along the way, and then we'll step back to look at the big picture, which will raise some additional issues and questions that are, shall we say, a little dicey, and that relate to food and to agriculture.
All right, so first up, let's talk about blackbirds. For each species we talk about tonight, we want to look at when and how high concentrations fit into their overall life history. And you can infer some things from this map taken from Joanna's childhood birding book. The purple zone marks where red-winged blackbirds were considered to be present year-round, including Missouri, but there's some northward migration during the breeding season to the pink zone. Thanks to a lot of citizen science data and some computer modeling wizardry, we can now visualize in far more detail what red-winged blackbirds do over the course of a year. This is an animated map from eBird's Status and Trends. If you haven't explored these, you should. And just a brief note, we're going to mention a lot of interesting resources tonight, and we'll share a list and links via the MoBirds listserv at the end of the talk. Now, these maps don't literally track birds, but rather they model abundances over time based on eBird data. Now, pay attention to the week of the year bar over here, as this will help you track time, in this case from January through December. So let's run this. You can see that red-winged blackbirds spread out across breeding grounds during summer, but then move southward and concentrate again during winter. This map captures patterns on the time scale of weeks and over a fairly high-resolution spatial scale, but it doesn't capture daily dynamics at a more local scale. Winter blackbird populations often gather at large overnight roost sites, but these are complex. They don't always occur in the same place every year, and they don't always persist throughout the entire winter season. But this hasn't been comprehensively studied or documented. We developed this map showing possible past and present sites of large winter blackbird concentrations in Missouri by collecting data and reports from many different sources. We're familiar with one roost in particular, the one we found in northern Boone County. So it turns out that this roost is a pretty reliable show, or at least it has been since January 2020, and probably at least a year before that. The roost is on private property, but there's a public road that dead ends at a location overlooking the site where you can park and watch without imposing directly on anyone's front yard. That setup is just pure luck. Red-winged blackbirds are by far the dominant species here, followed by common grackles. We've also seen cohesive flocks of hundreds of starlings, though taxonomically, these aren't blackbirds. Rusty blackbirds and cowbirds have played minor supporting roles, and females are definitely present as well. Arrival isn't always from the same direction or in the same fashion, but usually commences 30 to 45 minutes before sunset as rivers of birds begin to arrive. The birds often settle in surrounding trees at incredible densities, making them look leafed out. As the concentration grows, they begin to whirl over the field, giving amazing demonstrations of murmuration flights. As dusk falls, they settle ever more densely into the field's vegetation, stacking many birds vertically even as flocks continue to whirl overhead. We've never managed to stay late enough to hear activity cease. We've only been there once at dawn, and it didn't have some of the evening's drama. No temporary roosting in trees or amazing murmurations. The birds just kind of up and left. But the sound was mesmerizing. We feel a thrill every time we experience the roost dynamics. Each evening is unique, and we never know quite what will happen, or even if it will happen. There was actually a period in late January 2022 when activity ceased, and we thought the roost was done, but it's since come back strong. When we were up there in early January this year, we saw more birds than we had ever seen before. One of the joys of sharing this roost with others has been that it seems to act as a spark that ignites the innate human curiosity. And there are all sorts of great questions, many of which we don't have answers for. How did they find this in the first place? How do they know to come here? Does a given individual always forage at the same group? How do they decide which direction to go any given day? What does a daily foraging path look like if we could follow one? How good are they at judging the time it will take them to get back to the roost from their far extent? How do they not collide? What does all that chatter mean? What kind of communication is happening? What do they do when the weather is really miserable? Why do they sit in the trees before going to the grasses? Why do they use so much energy flying around? How often does a hawk actually snag a meal? Is the grass tall and robust enough to keep the birds out of reach of ground-based predators like coyotes? And what is that grass anyway? Oh, finally a question we can answer. That is miscanthus, a perennial grass that was planted as an experimental biomass crop in a smattering of central Missouri fields during the mid-2010s. It's supposed to be sterile, but how many times have we been told that such and such a plant doesn't produce viable seeds and then it turns out to be invasive? Plants are really good at figuring out how to reproduce. And if the right genetic work kicks off chain of seed production, that triggers the potential for rapid spread, especially when a couple million seed-eating birds are roosting in it every winter. And here's a worrying observation. In fall of 2021, we saw one miscanthus plant far from its friends and then 3 new plants this year. This has us worried that seed production has begun. This field sat unharvested for multiple years, probably due to a collapse in demand. So on one hand, we have a field with uncertain economic value that requires maintenance to keep it from getting out of control via rhizomes, and that may already be escaping by seed. And on the other hand, we have a couple million birds that have decided they really like this miscanthus as a winter roost site. So this raises some difficult questions. Should non-native, potentially invasive plants be eradicated to reduce the probability of spread, even if that would be bad for native birds? Or should non-native plants be preserved and managed to provide important habitat for native birds, even if it risks the spread of a new invasive? But ultimately, this is private land, and management decisions rest with the landowner and farmer. This isn't a native or a natural habitat, and they have a legitimate financial interest in crop management here. But this should be a broader discussion. And the surprise twist, as of this past weekend, everything has changed. We got a text from the landowner on Saturday afternoon letting us know that harvest was ongoing and might be finished by that very evening. We dropped everything and raced up there in time to watch and film the masses of very confused and agitated birds swirling over the valley, trying to figure out where all the grass went. It was an amazing spectacle, and we'll be releasing another video on YouTube at some point documenting the arc of the evening. We certainly had to scramble to revise this portion of the talk. So the story arc of this roost has changed, but the broader questions remain. I'm just going to let this time lapse finish playing out because it's fascinating. These are the birds swirling overhead as they try to figure out what to do with only about 5 or 10% of the miscanthus remaining unharvested. So how would you feel if such a roost moved in next to you? And we're going to pause here and get some answers posted in the chat. Let us know, how would you react? And this is for posterity, so be honest. Give us some feedback. What would you do if a roost like this moved in overhead?
Happy or less so?
I can't see the chat. Do you see anything?
Terrified and delighted.
Terrified and delighted.
That's a good answer.
That's a good answer.
Depends on impact, I suppose.
Depends on impact. All right, so even folks who put out bird feed get pretty upset about even moderate flocks of blackbirds stopping by now and then to raid the feeders. Now imagine the noise and mess from having 2 million visiting your yard night after night all winter. Also, there's a potential for disease from histoplasmosis that has been documented with some blackbird roosts. We get the impression, though we're not experts here, that it's probably pretty minor if you're just visiting now and then benign weather conditions. But what if you live next door and are subjected to dust on a windy day or during harvest? Would you feel differently? Although this is one of the coolest phenomena we've ever experienced as birders, living under it day in, day out for months at a time would be a serious drag. The Department of Conservation recognizes that most people's response to a roost moving into a neighborhood is negative. And this is a big enough issue that they have a whole webpage addressing what to do. Notice that starlings are listed here. Taxonomically, they're not blackbirds, but they're often grouped together for behavioral reasons. Being non-native, starlings can be controlled outside of regulations, but you might be surprised to learn that there are in fact provisions for control actions to be taken on some native species as well. There are even pesticides aimed at controlling birds. Here's some online advertising for one example. There seems to be a certain amount of controversy about this particular control measure because it's just supposed to scare birds, but in some cases it's resulted in birds reportedly dropping dead in urban areas. At the Boone County Roost, we don't know of any specific actions taken to disperse the birds, but the point here is that the needs of birds and people can clash in a situation like this, and the answers aren't easy. But this is something we should be talking about, not just ignoring. In spite of all these concerns, these roosts are an amazing phenomenon to experience, and they're worth seeking out. So how would you go about viewing blackbirds in big numbers? Well, you can still check out the Boone County Roost. We published a detailed report in the Bluebird back in 2020, and we posted a summary video on our YouTube channel with lots of footage just last week. And we'd still be interested in hearing reports from the site over the following weeks and months. How did the birds respond over time? But there are other ways to do this. You can look for reports of large flocks and follow them. That's how we found this roost. You can look for potential roost sites and monitor them, see if the birds show up. And you can visit daytime feeding grounds and observe what the birds do and potentially follow them from there. Overall, we suspect there are other little-known roost sites waiting to be discovered. After all, we found 2 to 3 million birds just 15 miles from Missouri's fourth largest city. What else might be out there across the state?
All right, now we're going to shift gears to snow geese. So you've probably seen this graph before. It shows population trend estimates for various groups of birds over time since 1970. And for understandable reasons, everyone seems to focus on the ones that are declining. For example, grasslands birds are some of the ones that show the most dramatic declines, and that's very relevant in our state. But I don't hear much talk about what's going on up here. An increase of over 1,000% for geese and swans, it doesn't even fit on the page. You have to shrink the graph down a lot to get a scale bar to go up to 1,000% to be able to plot the current situation. What's up with that? Let's delve a little deeper. So snow geese spend the summer breeding season up north using habitats including tundra and tidal marshes. And then the central population overwinters in coastal habitats along the Gulf of Mexico. Well, at least they used to. But as eBird data sets show, and our experience tells us, that's not the case anymore. Plenty of snow geese winter in our state and other areas that are far from the Gulf Coast. So let's look at the status and trends animation beginning in January. And you can watch as the geese migrate north to high latitude areas for breeding, and then draw down back to their wintering zones, which include Missouri. So this winter range expansion has paralleled a population expansion. Between about 1950 and 1970, the population was kind of stable, and then it really started to increase. So the paper associated with this graph attributes the increase to changes in winter feeding. The time when population started expanding coincided with a winter range expansion into agricultural areas with rice fields and cornfields. So in these places, snow geese can fatten up on leftover waste grain. But it's not like cornfields were invented in 1970. So why would they suddenly expand into ag fields? Well, this graph reminded me of another famous graph. This is a graph of US corn yield over time. The x-axis shows the year and the corn yield is on the y-axis. Note that this is yield per acre, not total yield. So this is reflecting an increase in the amount of corn off of a given unit area. So does that sharp increase remind you of the previous graph? Well, correlation doesn't prove causation, and there's a bit of a time lag between when the corn yield increases and the goose yield increases, but it should at least raise this question. To what extent did the intensification of agriculture in particular drive an explosion in the snow goose population? Well, whatever the exact causes, there are consequences to there being so many geese. These are intertidal habitats along Hudson Bay, from a paper on habitat degradation by snow geese. And here's the same location 13 years later. You can see that same tower in both photos. So this is an example of why by the late 1990s, people were ringing alarm bells about the goose population being too high. and there was general agreement that something needed to be done about it. So the outcome of this was the Light Goose Conservation Order, which goes back to about 1999. And the strategy here was to use hunters as management tools to control the population by expanding the season and relaxing the regulations to make it easier to cull geese and hopefully reduce the population. So did it work? Well, hunting isn't always a foolproof control measure. We have some firsthand experience of working hard to exert some population control on a troublesome animal and finding that even hunting success doesn't necessarily keep up with the population growth. So did the Light Goose Conservation Order work? Well, the latest numbers I could find suggest that the exponential growth has at least ended. But based on the reading I've done, the hunting has not reduced the population as much as intended or desired. Okay, but let's pivot to a birdwatching perspective. Does this graph with its decline at the end mean that we've missed an opportunity for the maximum snow goose observations? Well, the Missouri state record high count, according to eBird at least, was in 2014 with about 1.4 million birds at Les Bluffs. And Les Bluffs routinely has reports of some of the highest numbers of snow geese in the state. So the Fish and Wildlife Service graph isn't complete for the last few years, though, because of a time lag in data collection. But we do have up-to-date eBird data. And those data sets show that huge concentrations of geese are still being seen. The peak numbers reported at Les Bluffs in the last 3 years have been between 700,000 and 1 million geese each spring. So it's worth remembering, though, that the high count numbers at a given site wouldn't necessarily be expected to track the overall population changes. And one source I encountered even suggested that hunting efforts may in fact encourage the snow geese to gather in ever larger flocks. Think safety in numbers. So it's complicated, but there are still lots of snow geese out there to be seen. When we think about observing snow geese, it's helpful to understand a bit about their migratory dynamics. And this is where modern tracking technology is just so cool and amazing. So this animation shows movements of individual snow geese that were tagged in northern Alaska, and each color represents an individual. What I want you to notice is their pattern of movement. So you'll see periods of relative stability during which geese feed and rest in an area, and this is during the winter right now. And then those periods of stability are punctuated by long, rapid migratory moves, which are starting to kick in like this. So this pattern of movement is helpful to understand if your goal is to observe huge numbers of snow geese. Because geese use stopover locations, and yes, you can see them in the air almost anywhere, but it's really exciting to see those large numbers at stopover locations on the ground. And stopover locations, which are usually refuges and conservation areas, are not always entirely consistent from year to year, though Les Bluffs is as close as it comes to being a guarantee. So in general, the peak timing is between mid-February and mid-March, especially in central and northwest Missouri. So we are coming up on goose watching season. The exact timing, though, is not readily predictable weeks in advance. It's too dependent on weather. So it can be hard to pre-schedule a goose field trip. Your best bet, at least if you don't have time for a wild goose chase of your own, is to pay attention to the reports of others and to go to a site with reported big numbers as soon as you can, because there's a decent chance that they might stay and feed for a few days before making their next migratory jump.
And now let's move along to a similar dynamic with trumpeter swans. Back in the 1980s, Missouri wasn't even on the trumpeter swan map. Back in the 1930s, only 69 swans were even known to remain alive in the United States. But today, like snow geese, swans' population and wintering range has dramatically expanded. Watch them move up from the Midwest, spread out across the north, and then move back down again. This is a far cry from 1930. And let's watch that again at a more local scale. Notice all the geese starting, or swans starting here in Missouri. Whoop, hey, come on, run. There we go. And a lot of our local ones, they only go as far as Iowa or Minnesota, maybe Manitoba, and then they come right back down again and spend their winter in Missouri. All right. So trumpeter swans are not as numerous as geese, but what they lack in numbers, they make up for in mass. One trumpeter swan is the weight equivalent of 1,000 warblers. Now, think about how awkward it is for a turkey to take flight. Then think about swans and the fact that they don't just fly, they migrate. Can you imagine massive flocks of migrating turkeys soaring overhead? So how did trumpeter swans make this transition? Well, for one thing, they're the sort of charismatic megafauna that have their own advocacy nonprofit with lots of effort put into breeding, reintroduction, and even public outreach. Swan reintroductions began in the 1960s in Minnesota and expanded to Wisconsin, Michigan, Ontario, and Iowa through the 1990s, with reintroductions still happening in the West. These efforts raise an important question, though, about what constitutes a valid bird record. Human-assisted versus wild is not always a black and white distinction. So how do you decide when a bird is wild enough to count in the records? As far as we know, reintroduction efforts never targeted Missouri, but trumpeter swans started returning here on their own in the mid-1980s. But as late as 2006, a trumpeter swan sighting was rejected from official records because it was potentially human-assisted. So did the birding community lose an opportunity to collect data about the recolonization of swans across the state because certain sightings were considered wild enough? This can be a slippery slope. Should we not accept observations from bird feeders either? Recent research has shown that Carolina wrens can alter their behavior to become dependent on bird feeders, becoming less wild in the process. And we actually have a video about this on our channel. There are complicated implications here for the populations of birds that can or can't adapt to human-provided food resources. Speaking of which, the growth of Missouri's winter swan population will remind you of snow geese. You can fit a pretty good exponential growth curve to this, but that rate of expansion can't continue forever. And again, this raises difficult questions. What will eventually regulate this population? And how many swans is too many? They've already been reported causing damage to wild rice production in Minnesota. But there are also people deeply opposed to swan hunting. So what does the future look like? It's not clear. But in the meantime, large flocks of trumpeter swans are an inspiring experience. When last we checked, 3 locations in Missouri have had eBird reports of over 1,000 swans at once: Lusk Bluffs, Wakanda State Park, and Riverlands. And many others have had reports of at least 300. Some of these sites are pretty reliable. For example, this one in western Audrain County is a farm pond surrounded by cornfields, and in our experience, swans are often hanging out foraging nearby. Just a few weeks ago, we easily found over 300 up there foraging grain in roadside fields. At our home in northern Boone County, in just the last few years, swan flyovers have become a normal occurrence anywhere from weekly to daily, up to 59 in a single day. They're out there.
So we wanted to touch very briefly on swallows, particularly one big roost phenomenon that's often referred to as the swallow spectacle. This is one that we have not personally experienced, and we appreciate the firsthand counts from those who have seen and monitored it. So this is a migratory roost that occurs after the breeding season. It occurs in the fall, usually in the range of mid-September to mid-October, depending on the weather. And the roost ranges in size from a few 100,000 to an estimated 2 million birds or so. The dominant species are tree swallows especially, as well as barn swallows. And as far as I know, this is a one-of-a-kind roost in the state. And that suggests to me that there's something special about the location. So the birds usually settle into roost in an unharvested cornfield in the area in the red circle. But I suspect that the broader surroundings are pretty important. So you may notice quite a bit of public land in the vicinity. And if we look at the land use layer, you'll notice that compared to much of the state, there's a lot of blue here. And not just open water, but various shades of blue that on this map indicate different kinds of wetland habitat. So here the brown represents crop fields and the yellow pastures. So given that swallows are dominantly insectivores, I'm guessing that all this wetland habitat provides a pretty good food source for this quantity of birds. In recent years, though, it seems that there have been changes to the roost dynamics such that the roost size and the location are less reliable than past observations suggested. No one knows exactly why. Is it possible that the swallow roost just moved to a new location and not enough people have been out on the ground to find it? Well, if you think it's impossible for giant roosts to go under the radar of birders, look no farther than the Boone County blackbird roost because it shows it's quite possible. It can be pretty hard for just a few people to fully keep tabs on what's going on. Monitoring of things like this should be a community effort. So this talk is partly a call to action to encourage you to get out and look for these big concentrations of birds and to report them so that we as a community know what's there and we know when and if things change or if roosts disappear. So I think it's important for birders to be out there with eyes and ears watching for and reporting on these phenomena. So when it comes to reporting, there's one practical matter that we should address. How do you determine how many birds there are? I think it's always good to seek advice from those with a lot of experience. So I was glad to get some advice from Edge Wade on how to count birds. Her solidly researched suggestion is to count fast. Fortunately, many of us started with a good solid teacher when it comes to avian counting. Oh, wait, that's not birds in big numbers. That's more like big bird in numbers. All right, seriously though, this is a non-trivial issue. Estimating how many birds are present in big flocks is hard. eBird has a couple of articles that provide some advice, and the Fish and Wildlife Service also has a very helpful page with an opportunity to quiz yourself and see how you're doing. This is hard, but it's one of those skills that we can get better at with practice. And there are a variety of methods. You can take photos and count after the fact on the photos. There are cases of even using satellite images to determine the area occupied. In the case of the blackbird roost, we use some back of the envelope calculations to come up with a number. It's not always easy. The conclusion may not always be exactly right. It's always good practice to err on the conservative side. But a report with some uncertainty is better than no report at all.
So while seeing birds in big numbers is fun, it's now time to take a step back and start asking some of these big, tough questions. As this graph demonstrates, the story isn't as simple as all birds are declining. When was ecology ever simple? If nothing else, we're not convinced that the 1970s should necessarily be the baseline for, well, anything. As far as we're concerned, an overlooked part of the story is that humans are reshaping bird diets. Many of the birds that are expanding are grain foragers. Declines are more complicated, but certain food-related patterns stand out, such as declines among insectivores. So to us, the story isn't a simple matter of decline, but of creating both winners and losers through government policy and individual actions within a complicated ecological framework that nobody fully understands. So let's talk about agriculture, the most obvious manifestation of these choices. This is an aerial photo of an industrial crop field near our property. See that pond? It used to host blackbirds, waterfowl, and other diversity, but it was plowed under to plant more corn. See that fence row at the bottom? It too used to host birds and other diversity as well. It was plowed under to plant more corn. This kind of thing has real impacts on bird populations, and this isn't just an isolated example of an irresponsible landowner. This is what the nation's agricultural policy is incentivizing farmers to do by directly and indirectly subsidizing them to grow as much corn and soy as possible, regardless of the consequences to soil, to birds, to human health, and to the climate. So what can feed an industrial field like this? Well, especially in fall and winter when waste grain is available as a food supply, swans and geese are right at home. And so are blackbirds. If you're thinking they're a little small to eat corn, well, stomach content analyses have proven that they do, and often as a substantial component of their diet. They also eat smaller seeds associated with agricultural weeds. Big corn isn't just fueling ethanol and obesity, it's also fueling some of these big bird populations. This is not a sign of pristine nature. But what can breed in an industrial ag field? Maybe killdeer? Certainly not any of the grassland birds that are among those showing the most concerning declines. And this is an issue that is only growing. Here's a USDA crop map for part of West Central Missouri. Everything shown in green and yellow is corn and soy fields in a region that used to host abundant prairie. But this is for a single year. What's been happening over time? Here's an overall land use map showing North Central Missouri in 2001, where brown is crop fields, yellow is hay or pasture, and green is forest. Now I'm going to advance this map to 2019. What change did you see? I saw a lot more brown. I'll toggle that once more. 2001, 2019. Now, to make this clear, here's a map of change in land use from 2001 through 2019. Everything in orange marks land converted to crop fields during that time from some other cover over just 18 years. Crop expansion at the expense of other habitats isn't something that just happened in the settler era. It's ongoing aggressively today, and it comes with broader problems than just habitat loss. Pesticide is an overarching term that includes insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides. These are absolutely required in the paradigm of modern industrial farming, but abundant research and water testing clearly documents that they're overapplied and don't stay where they're put. This stuff ends up where it doesn't belong, in water, in the air, on neighboring properties. Orchards, vegetable farms, and even other industrial fields have suffered serious economic damage from increasing levels of spray drift. The label may say don't spray it on water, but do you really think that guidance gets followed? It certainly didn't when drift from a crop duster impacted our farm in 2014, even though we were separated from the application field by a treed riparian corridor. Here's just one example. Glyphosate, commonly known as Roundup. The growth in use over time is astonishing, and most of it is applied to large-scale corn and soy. You might look at that and think, well, at least the use has leveled off. But that's only because it's stopped working. Weeds have evolved resistance, and now other more powerful and more drift-prone herbicides are increasingly being used. This is one of the reasons we're not farming anymore, commercially anymore. After our drift incident and the state's anemic response, we couldn't live with the ongoing uncertainty that all of our hard work and income was tied up in something that could be destroyed by agricultural chemicals being applied a quarter-mile away through a thick riparian tree cover. The weeds that are adapting and thriving in spite of herbicides are wind-pollinated, not insect-pollinated. And this leads to an important point. Industrial agriculture doesn't just kill insects directly via insecticides, it kills them indirectly via herbicides by encouraging the spread of wind-pollinated plants at the expense of insect-pollinated plants. The industrial agricultural mindset that food crops should be monocultures living in an ecological vacuum is a fundamentally very different way of thinking from farming even a few decades earlier. So as we've been criticizing industrial ag, some of you have probably been thinking, well, yeah, but we have to eat, which is true. But we need to think big about the paradigm of food production and about new ways to connect it to birds and ecology. Here's how we think most people think about the landscape, if they think about it at all. There are places where we produce food, and those places don't have or need nature. And there are places that are refuges for nature, but those places don't and shouldn't produce human food. The problem with this mental model is that as you expand agricultural land, it inevitably comes at the expense of wilder places. But if you stop thinking of nature and agriculture as an either or and start thinking about these things as end members on a continuum, you can realize there's a lot of potential in the middle ground for diversified, ecologically conscious agriculture that provides food and habitat for both people and nature. A while back, we coined the phrase integrating food and farming into the ecosystem as a motto for what our farm was trying to achieve. It's remarkable how adaptable birds can be if given the chance, as demonstrated by this indigo bunting nest in a non-native annual crop of okra. The nest didn't go exactly as planned, as an okra pod grew right up into the nest. Yet this didn't do any lasting harm, and our garden remains highly sought after bunting territory, judging from the annual ruckus that ensues as males stake out claims early each summer. The University of Missouri's Bradford Research Farm is an example of a location that has plenty of agriculture, but is also a magnet for birders, because its diversity hosts a lot of good birds, including quite a nice collection of grassland birds and the eBird records. Bradford does a relatively good job of interspersing productive crop fields with other habitat patches. If this can be a birding hotspot, imagine what could be achieved with an agricultural model that was compatible with true grasslands. As it happens, that model does exist, but it challenges the paradigm that meat is inherently bad for the environment and climate. The National Audubon Society has a program that certifies grass-based ranches as bird-friendly, recognizing that large grazing ruminants are an integral part of healthy grassland ecosystems, and that it's more economically practical to help responsible ranchers make a living than to try and convert the entire plains into a giant nature reserve. Buying beef directly from certified ranches or other responsible grass-based producers is an immediate way to vote for better land management practices. For example, here's just one of the many well-managed direct-to-consumer grass-based ranches here in central Missouri. This is a much better model than the standard one, in which overgrazing leads to barren pastures and soil erosion before the cattle are shipped off to feedlots to fatten up on corn and soy grown in ecologically sterile fields. Imagine a world in which we paid responsible ranchers to manage grasslands instead of paying row crop farmers to plow them under. You can see these dynamics in the 4 groups of birds we talked about tonight. 3 can use waste grain as an important part of their diet, while insects are keys for swallows. And as we mentioned, there's a sense that the swallow roost may be getting less vibrant lately. Are swallows declining because insects are declining? Are insects declining because of pesticides, including herbicides? These are complex questions without simple answers. The birds we talked about tonight are often overlooked or dismissed by birders. We suggest that it's at least as important to go chasing after lots of normal birds, not just the occasional abnormal ones. Speaking of which, another factor influencing the divergent patterns in this graph relates to how we place value on different species. Is it a coincidence that birds with economic value, like ducks and geese, have had chains of large government refuges built for them to ensure migratory success? Is it a coincidence that mega charismatic swans have recovered given their dedicated advocacy groups? What if we attached the same intensity of purpose and funding to grassland birds? This should not be taken as a shot at hunting. We're hunters too, and we feel that it's an essential part of both conservation and culture. But you can see the same dynamic in non-bird species. Game animals like deer have exploded in population like hoofed geese, with many similar threats to habitat and even human health. Yet we continue to manage our public woodlands to encourage easily huntable deer populations. Why? Well, the Missouri Extension estimates that deer hunting contributes over $1 billion and 12,000 jobs annually to Missouri's economy. If you divide that by last year's total deer harvest, you get a value of almost $4,000 per deer. Imagine what we could do for grasslands if every sparrow were valued at $4,000, and we established an equivalent chain of grassland reserves and private ranches managed for their benefit. Maybe we should start eating sparrows. Finally, in discussing birds in big numbers, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention bird flu. This has been a long simmering concern that's exploded into broader awareness. As we all know now, large, dense concentrations of individuals are most prone to disease transmission. So what are the implications for the exploding populations of waterfowl? Might these big grain-fed masses of long-distance migrants in fact be enabling bird flu? Are our land management choices creating or worsening a disease outbreak? Here are some numbers for mortality among the bird groups we've talked about from 2022 through early 2023, with national numbers followed by Missouri totals in parentheses. Definitely something to keep an eye on, and another reason to rethink the way we manage land and think about bird populations. By the way, should you encounter a dead wild bird, the Department of Conservation recommends that reports be sent to this email address, and we'll share that in our resources as well. So let's summarize. We asked at the outset whether birds in big numbers were a cause for celebration or concern. In fact, we're quite confident in saying that it's both. On the plus side, big flocks of birds are simply fun to watch and a great way to draw in new birders. And taking part in citizen science efforts helps us all contribute to better understanding of these dynamics. And active management can have successes too. Whatever the concerns now, it's legitimately cool that trumpeter swans have rebounded from near extinction. On the other hand, some of these concentrations are unnatural indicators of human mismanagement, and they can be vulnerable to disease or even active vectors of its spread. There are a lot of complicated questions without simple answers in the complex ecological system of the Anthropocene. So what to do about all this? Well, we can take a broad perspective and enjoy the stimulating challenges we face. We live in interesting times, and that's sometimes a hidden blessing. We can appreciate the complexity, which gives us so much to learn about. We can make personal choices. We may not be able to alter national policy, but we can vote for better land management with our dollars and our diets. We can enjoy birds in all numbers, big and small. We can engage in citizen science, helping increase our collective knowledge about birds and ecology. And we can work to share our ideas, concerns, and visions with others. We really love this quote. In the end, we will conserve only what we love love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we're taught. And this is why we're now working to share our knowledge, experience, and ideas through talks like this and through our YouTube channel. So if you found this talk worthwhile, the best way to thank us is to go to our channel, watch some videos, subscribe, interact, and share it with others. We're really, really grateful to MRBO and the Missouri Birding Society for inviting us to give this talk, as it let us prod at some complex questions, maybe even stir up a little hornet's nest a little bit. But we hope this will generate some interesting questions and discussion. These are issues we need to be talking about, whatever you think about them. Discussion of science is helpful. So we're posting a full list of resources on the MoBirds listserv, and we're going to put a link to that in the Zoom chat so you can find those resources easily. And with that, we are done, and we'll happily stick around and talk about whatever questions you might have. Thank you again for listening.
Eric, Joanna, bravo. That was truly delightful. I learned a lot of stuff. I've seen that the two of you have been answering some questions in the Q&A. It looks like there's a few more, as well as some folks sharing some of their experiences. It looks like luckily those were posted to everyone.
Yeah, Dana, one of the ones I actually typed in a brief answer to, I want to get back to because it's a good question. I have a longer answer than I was going to type. There's the question about, with intensification of modern agriculture and better equipment and so on, isn't waste grain not a thing because we have better equipment and better practices? Well, two answers to that is that, one, you can easily go out in the winter and see waste grain all over the place. So the eye test says clearly not, because it's everywhere in a cornfield. And these birds are clearly foraging on it. There's no reason for thousands of geese or swans to be in these cornfields unless they're eating. The other answer is that this is a question almost of scale. If you think about that graph of intensifying corn yield per acre, if we increase corn yield 1,000-fold, even if a piece of equipment gets 10 times more efficient as it was, say, in the 1950s, even a tiny fraction of that 1,000-fold increase being left on the ground is still more corn than was getting left in, say, the 50s. So intensification comes overall with just a sheer mass of food being left behind. So that's the answer there. Not only can you go see it for yourself, but intensification, even more efficiency, still doesn't mean you're not leaving a higher amount of material behind, because 1% of 1,000 is still a lot of corn. So yeah, go ahead and read off some other questions, or we can look at them too.
Sorry, I've got too many windows open with Q&A and chat. So Francis at the beginning asked about what they have heard of as enumeration, and Ethan said murmuration. But could you just explain really quickly what a murmuration is and whether or not any of your
murmuration
videos
is one of these
showed that?
fancy science words that we use because coining a single word is easier than using a paragraph to describe it every time we're talking about it. It basically refers to the way that masses of birds fly as a single, like they're a single organism, the way they dart back and forth, swirl, move as if their brains were all linked together by a Bluetooth signal. You see a similar thing in large schools of fish, right? When you think about these massive schools of fish swimming and doing this, in birds, it's called murmuration. It simply means that flight pattern that we still don't scientifically really understand how they do that. One of the ideas out there is that it's almost random in that a single bird up front makes a motion and their reflexes are so fast that the motion simply ripples down through the flock faster than we can see. But there are other answers to that as well. Some people still wonder if there's some kind of rapid communication happening, but it's the idea of this incredible boom, 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 thing
There's
going
been
on.
interesting computer modeling, I think, that can use particles. Each bird cues off a certain number of birds in its vicinity, and you can simulate similar behavior based on certain rules. But it's pretty interesting.
You might have seen computer models somewhere of how particles spread throughout a room. I think some of these got real popular in early COVID times. You send a single particle in, then another particle, and they split and they produce, and suddenly bing, 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 they're all over the place. That's kind of like murmuration. This sort of things can move really quickly when they're keying off each other. So. But yeah, murmuration is the correct term for it. And it's just because you heard how long it took me to describe that. You don't want to write that paragraph in every scientific paper. Use murmuration.
Eric and Joanna, some folks just had a couple comments. You have a lot of thanks comments for an excellent presentation. But there were a couple. Dan mentions that there's been a significant increase in bald eagles, both during the winter and in nesting birds. Here's a question from Chris about love the incorporation of the old bird book. What's your best guess on the relative accuracy between those old books? They have a couple versus current sources.
For range maps, as you can see, the range maps are pretty out of date for a lot of birds.
Because the ranges have changed in a lot of cases, as in the snow geese and things like black vultures, we're starting to see those here and they didn't used to be here. So for the time they were made, I'm guessing they were decent, but as you can see in that bird book in particular, the resolution was terrible. Those were individual pixels, and I'm sure people had better maps than that. Like there are lots of detailed state records being kept. So birders had a pretty good idea of where things were, but there's been a lot of change in the 40 years since then.
But even so, even if the ranges hadn't changed, keep in mind how revolutionary citizen science has been.
Absolutely.
Because no matter what, that 1980 bird book was still based on a handful of studies and a handful of professionals. Amateur birders were only contributing so much to the knowledge base because there really wasn't a pipeline for amateur birder information to make it into scientific data. Now, 90% of that data, I'm making this number up, but a huge amount of that data is submitted by amateurs, not by, quote, scientists, because there are thousands of us across the state watching birds every day. So when you're looking at things like the blackbirds, we found those blackbirds, that blackbird roost, because another amateur birder reported seeing a couple million blackbirds, they thought, up in a cornfield somewhere. There was no researcher up there. There was no MU ornithologist up there. They would never have thought to go up and sit in a cornfield and look for birds. But an amateur birder saw it, reported it. We saw the report, went and looked. We tracked those birds for 10 miles and we found a massive unknown roost. This is citizen science in action. So no matter how accurate those old bird books are, they can't possibly be as accurate as our modern understanding based on thousands, if not millions of people all watching and reporting birds. And this is why it's so important for birding to encompass common birds as well as rare birds. It's common for, a snowy owl to show up in the Ozarks and 500 birders go tearing off after it, look at the snowy owl, but 2 million blackbirds show up and nobody even notices. We need to be expanding the paradigm of birding to include all birds. And that's one of the core takeaways here is blackbirds aren't boring, geese aren't boring, they're still interesting, they're still fascinating. We need to be paying attention to these so we understand what's going on both rise and fall. And that's something only citizen science can do because there can't be enough ornithologists out there tracking all this stuff.
But if any researchers want to pick up on this blackbird roost, there are a whole bunch of interesting questions that we'd love to get answered.
Yeah, the flip side is we can't afford to be full-time blackbird researchers.
Yeah.
We have other business, so. Another question to go back to the person who mentioned the eagles, and this is the point we didn't put in the talk, but we hoped it would come up. I think another dynamic here, obviously eagles aren't grain feeders in a meaningful way.
And obviously they're recovering from DDT issues that plummeted the population.
Right, so there are outright conservation successes in terms of, getting rid of contaminants and so on. But another factor is, if you think about, someone asked about Canada geese as well, a lot of the birds that are expanding, even if they aren't grain foragers, they're riding the coattails of economically valuable grain foragers, because we put this whole chain of wetlands, national wildlife refuge, wetlands in place for the economically valuable ducks and geese. And guess what? Birds that can also use those things, like dabbling ducks and eagles and certain shorebirds, their numbers aren't doing so bad either. But that's because we have focused on this one narrow swath of habitat and viability, and anything that can use that is benefiting. Anything that can't use that is not benefiting. So I would argue that eagles, separate from the DDT thing, are also benefiting from having habitat restoration that wasn't meant for them, but that they're able to use. But we're not doing that for grasslands or deep woodlands or other places that aren't getting nearly the same attention in land management.
I think the refuge system, wetlands, the wetland reserve easement program, our state conservation areas, and those of other states are just a great argument that conservation works. Those numbers support that.
Mhm.
Backing up just a sec to when you just said it'd be great if people took up research on that blackbird roost, it also seems like it was an awesome opportunity for outreach as well. And I wanted to ask, you said at one point the landowner texted you when they were harvesting. So how's the relationship with the landowner, and what did they feel about having that blackbird roost there?
So that's there's a long story there. For most of the time we monitored this, we didn't actually have a direct contact with the landowner. It's not a landowner that lives on site. They live elsewhere. They live in Columbia. I think it's family land, but they have a cabin up there, but they don't go up there on a routine basis. And they've contracted out the farming to another non-resident farmer who also doesn't live there. So we actually only met the landowner just a few weeks before the harvest. It was actually on our last previous visit. The landowner happened to just stop by and was kind of checking on the property on a Friday evening and stopped by and said, "Hey, you guys watching birds?" Yeah. And we had a conversation, exchanged contact information, and he was interested. They were aware of it. Susan Hazelwood knew the landowners and had kind of been an intermediary between the birding community and the landowners. And we had sort of gotten the sense they didn't necessarily want to be directly involved because Susan was kind of acting as an intermediary. So we kind of respected our sense that, they wanted, we had their own things. We didn't push it, but we ended up being really grateful to have spent like half an hour talking to the landowner because, we exchanged information. We texted back and forth a few times, talking about, he thought it was cool. He thought it was interesting.
He's active in managing the parts of the property that aren't farmed. He was doing some invasive management. We talked about some of the miscanthus that might be.
Yeah, he was very concerned about the miscanthus point jumping. He was like, "Oh wow, I need to get on that." Like he's very conservation minded in this sense. So the timing was really lucky that we finally got a direct connection to him, because sure enough, Saturday afternoon we got this random text. "Oh, by the way, my farmers let me know they started harvesting yesterday. It'll be done tonight." And we just, I ran into the house and drop everything. We're hitting the road. But yeah, it's a good example of, we often tend to focus on public land as a conservation resource, but private land, I forget the percentage, but it's what, 90% of the land in Missouri, something like this. 9%. And it can be a double-edged sword. Sometimes private land can have some of the devastation of things like bulldozing trees to plant corn, but it can also be the site of some of these successes, because no conservation area would ever have planted a field of miscanthus. It's a non-native, potentially invasive plot. No government agency would have planted that. But doing that created a really unique chance to find out what these birds might like. We actually didn't say this in the talk, but a lot of people have asked us this. Our personal theory is that miscanthus is simulating the much larger swaths of wetland vegetation that used to be in many parts of Missouri. Missouri used to have a lot of wetlands and tall, think cattails, think marsh grasses. That's almost completely been eradicated. But all of a sudden, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, these birds found this, 150 acres or whatever it is of tall wetland-like vegetation and went, "Oh yeah, our genes are used to this. We have thousands of years of genetics saying we want to roost in this," and they went berserk over it. So, a private landowner maybe gave us a little bit of a clue as to what these birds might want, and maybe we should be thinking about managing public land to create more of this kind of habitat.
And can we use something native like giant cane to try to mimic that habitat, but without the invasiveness? And that has its own issues, but it creates some interesting ideas that are worth talking about.
And a last quick point there, that upper northeast corner of Boone County where the roost is, if you go back in historical records, so the early land descriptions, early settlers, a big chunk of northeastern Boone County is one of the last parts of the county to be settled because it was so wet, it was actually written about as malarial. It had a ton of marshland, a ton of wetland, even up there on the high ground, but it's flat. It doesn't drain quickly, right? So it was not settled early. It was outright described as pestilential, malarial. No one goes there. So, there's even a longer history of that being a wetland habitat than we might think when you drive up there now. And so, within the last couple hundred years, the birds were using that. Some birds were probably using it as a habitat, and then it vanished quickly. But that's, an older land use up there that we don't even think about when you drive through the cornfields now.
Eric and Joanna, brief question here. Can you go back one slide so that JL can check out the quote that you ended with?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I gotta go through a bunch of things, but we'll get there. Oh, come on.
And Leslie, I'm getting to your question here. Hopefully you're still on. Okay, Leslie asks, what about increased E. coli in lakes and waterways from the larger numbers of snow geese? I read a report a few summers ago about lakes in Mo and those increases. Do we know?
I think she's asking about Canada's, but the point stands. We mentioned histoplasmosis, but a lot of these large bird flocks they create a variety of human health hazards. I actually didn't include this again, but I've got a great photo from Kansas City. There's a beautiful city park right next to the river market area, kind of on the waterfront in Kansas City. I was up there last summer and there had been a huge flock of starlings there. And that park was utterly coated in excrement. I mean, park benches, paths, everything was utterly just complete sheen of bird excrement everywhere. And that's right next to the city's biggest farmers market and a bunch of food producers and a park where people hang out. Big concentrations are not always compatible with people. And everything from water quality to park bench quality to histoplasmosis and big roosts. Yeah, it's This is why control measures are out there. In fact, Joanna dug up a report from the 60s that Colombia actually had a starling problem and did a big old poisoning campaign in the 60s to get rid of starlings that were crapping everywhere in downtown.
But on the Canada goose question, that's also a situation that can be managed by habitat changes. For example, a lot of cities and parks have realized that if you plant woody things or allow those to grow along the edge of a lake or pond rather than mowing right up to the water, that deters the Canada geese. It disperses them. That's all you have to do. You don't have to go hunting or poison them or something like that. You change the habitat and you get a change in the birds.
But in the broader sense, I think it does raise questions because the sheer explosive growth in, say, snow geese and swans creates water quality problems in, quote, natural areas. We have wildlife refuges. What happens when these exponential numbers of geese continue crapping in the water there? You do get nutrient blooms. You do get problems that, these things aren't necessarily natural, or if they are, the rest of the habitat isn't catching up to a natural support for that many big birds crapping everywhere. So we have legitimate management concerns about what to do about essentially pollution from these things. You can get them out of a city park, but you can't get them out of, say, the pool of wildlife refuge.
Ethan, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I don't want to delve too far into the can of worms that they opened up here deliberately.
Can of corn.
Well, I would like to bring up the point that there's a couple things to consider when it's we're woefully ignorant of the the spread of these avian diseases. There hasn't been enough looking into it. But I'll note from the major disease outbreaks with avian flu that have happened throughout the world, through Asia and Europe, and now North America most recently again, that can spread really rapidly. The ultimate source, again, that's causing these things that spike up is actually confined factory farm operations with domestic birds creating disease. They're in basically disease incubators in the situations that they're raised and housed in. And then that can get transported by our wild populations, which are in a much more safe situation. I think it's important to bring it up and look at more carefully into this can of worms, because another component that we have to worry about is climate change. And the climate models are predicting a winter range expansion of some of these large populous flock species of settling actually more in Missouri and in northern climes, where they're going to encounter and be in proximity to more of these confined animal feeding operations, which could be like a perfect storm for massive radiation of disease and spread of these kind of epidemics. But I just wanted to add my 2 cents to that particular can of worms. But I do appreciate the commenter and questioner too on thinking about water quality and the effects of water quality. And then again, we have many impaired streams in Missouri, and we have to be conscientious citizens, understanding the political pressures that maybe DNR and other entities like water quality commissions are under, and be the citizen advocates and look out for that water quality there. And see what's going on. I mean, we have streams now we're not allowed to eat, or we're told not to eat more than 1 fish a month out of, there's other toxins and things that are even worse than E. coli, but there are a lot of streams that are impaired in Missouri now. And we need to think about that for human health and wildlife. That's my soapbox. I had to jump in on.
Thank you.
I see a question from someone about, are the blackbirds still using the area? That was 2 days ago. We don't know. That was literally Saturday night when it was harvested. We couldn't make it up Sunday night, and tonight here we are talking to you all. So yeah, we don't know. That's we live about 20 miles away, so it's just far enough to not be a routine drive up there every evening. We hope to get back. This is where Citizen Science comes in. Anyone who wants to get up there and take a look and tell us what's going on, we'd appreciate it. People have gone up there. We've certainly been the dominant monitors at the site, but it would be fascinating to know, do they just keep using the location to stay in the trees? Do they disperse? In a month, they'll start dispersing anyway, to their summer breeding season. But yeah, we don't know because it was 2 days ago.
And there's another miscanthus field out of view to the west that is along a road that has absolutely no safe parking whatsoever. And we haven't had a chance to check out whether that field has been harvested as well, because have some of them and more of them crammed in over to that other field, or has that field also been harvested? So they're all out of luck. So that's an open question. If anybody wants to check into this, I think we're going to probably try and get up there again pretty soon, but we would love to hear any reports from anyone else who goes up and follows up.
Eric and Joanna, if you go up, if you do end up being able to go there in the next few days, if you let me, I guess you'll post it on MoBirds and we can all see it probably, but I'd love to include that in the follow-up email to folks that registered for this webinar and get the recording and everything.
Ironically, we were initially thinking, well, we could plan like a Friday after the talk and we have a whole bunch of people meet up there and have lots of discussion and that'd be fun. And like, we can still do that. I don't know if we'll see anything.
Right.
So yeah, why don't we discuss and we can put something up on MoBirds or you can share it. And
it looks like there's one last question. Do you know if the birds were feeding on the miscanthus or simply roosting there?
it's a roost, yeah. They because in theory the miscanthus is supposed to be sterile and not produce seed. That's what the ag people tell us. So they forage during the day and then it's basically just, you know, a hotel room at night.
They leave at dawn. They spend their days foraging up to say 20 miles away out in mostly cornfields, sometimes in woods, and they come back in the evening and roost. It's a safe place to go when they're done foraging, but they will, again, if you go read the paper, but we found them by going up into the mass cornfields up north, finding big flocks foraging and following. We saw an unbroken river of birds from horizon to horizon, and we followed that river unbroken for 10 miles south to find the roost site as they returned in the evening. But they were going out and en masse foraging in cornfields primarily. And again, occasionally they'll change direction. They'll go in the woods and look for stuff in the woods. On our place west of there, we'll occasionally get masses of birds in our woodlands, just kind of making the woods vibrate.
Especially grackles seem to come into the woods.
Blackbirds tend to stay in the cornfields. We get grackles in the woods, but it's primarily corn is what they're there for. Corn is what they're eating, as many studies have shown. And that think about the amount of corn it takes to feed 2 million blackbirds every day for all winter. A lot of waste grain.
Follow-up question here. What is the use planned for the miscanthus that was harvested? What does it go to?
So it was originally intended as a biomass crop for energy. But the market doesn't seem to have been very good for that. So the research in the last few years that we've done has suggested that a lot of it is being put as a fibrous filler in pet food now, because that seems to be where the market is. We've gotten the sense, we've sort of wondered, reading between the lines, if that hasn't been paying very much, because there's another miscanthus field we're aware of that sometimes harvest the bales and then they'll sit there for almost a year before they get hauled off and go anywhere. So it's hard to find details on the exact economics, but it's a small scale crop because all of these were experimental fields in the first place.
And the irony here is that in a lot of ways, if there wasn't such an invasive potential, miscanthus in a lot of ways is a good movement toward a more sustainable agriculture. It's a perennial grass. It stays put. It doesn't need to be plowed. It doesn't need a lot of inputs. Doesn't need a lot of fertilizer or pesticides. It just stays there and grows, and it grows year after year. When you cut it, it's like, hey, you cut it, it grows. You cut it, it grows. So compared to corn and soy and the absolute devastation to the soil that causes, I mean, this kind of thing is fantastic. It's why if you haven't heard of the Land Institute, there's a research facility out in Kansas that's been desperately trying to traditionally breed a perennial wheat, a wheat that can just sprout and grow year after year like a true grass that you don't have to plow under and replant again. So there's this vision of perennial agriculture, meaning plants that just regrow and regrow and regrow and don't need to be plowed every year, seeded every year. So in that sense, yeah, if we could magically, create that system, that'd be great. But
it's better than ethanol.
Yeah, it's better. It's way better than ethanol. And it's better than corn, but it has a high invasive potential and no one's really been able to make a market for it. So it seems to have kind of sputtered, which is unfortunate in the sense that moving toward more perennial growth. And this is why we go back to hitting the grassland thing so hard, because going back to the beef thing, every cow that's raised on 100% grass, even the most beaten down pasture holds more soil than a bare soil crop field. It's not even close. So if we could be subsidizing grass the way we subsidize corn, we could have an entirely different landscape in the Great Plains. If we could turn all of that into perennial grass that resprouts and never sees a plow again, never sees a drill, that would be such an improvement on soil quality and water holding capacity, but we're not there.
we are both trained as geologists. My master's was looking at long-term erosion rates, and the erosion rates in the agricultural areas in the heart of this country are similar to the rate that the Himalayas are eroding. This is way, way faster than the place should be eroding. These are unsustainable rates of erosion. We are undercutting the soil for future human generations. And that needs to change. And one of the ways to change it is to go to perennial agriculture. I'm not sure miscanthus is the right approach, but things like chestnut trees, things that the agroforestry, Center for Agroforestry is working on, some of those are really smart solutions as far as I'm concerned.
And we'll always need some corn and soy. We'll always need some of that. But right now, 40% of the nation's corn crop goes to ethanol. Put that 40% right back in grass, frankly. Right there, you've got your grassland bird restoration right there.
I'm going to have to go ahead and say that along these lines, folks could listen to last week's webinar, which is folks from the Conservation Federation of Missouri talking about how to advocate and like how policy in our state works and what one can do to get involved, because these exact issues could be addressed by policy and programs. And as Eric and Joanna have mentioned, the funneling of subsidies or lack thereof. So a lot of these choices are made at a much, much higher level than really the individual landowner. It's an economic and policy system that is making this happen.
Yeah, as we hinted at earlier, this isn't something you start going around waving fingers at farmers. For the most part, they're in the system that they're being paid to do. You know, don't go waving your finger at a farmer who's trying to keep their family land when the government's showering money on do one thing. You know, up until a few years ago, the USDA would take away your corn subsidy if you even tried to plant vegetables. If you planted a watermelon patch or sweet corn patch, they'd take away your corn subsidy. It was that restrictive until a couple of years ago. So people are trapped in the system. It's a systemic problem, not a farmers are bad or farmers are evil. That's not the message here. But I would say that along with that kind of advocacy, as we mentioned, when we were farming commercially and selling, every person who spent money with us, that was a very direct vote. We noticed every purchase, every customer. That made a difference. That kept our land going. So you may feel like your vote or even your call to your rep, may or may not feel like it's getting somewhere, but your wallet keeps someone in business. Your wallet keeps someone on the land. Your wallet keeps grass on the land. Whether you're an individual, whether you're an organization, what you're buying, what you're doing, those are changes that someone will notice immediately when you spend that dollar. So that's another way to advocate is to opt out, so to speak, and then to opt into something different at whatever scale you can manage.
Reuters, I think that's our last question. Unless you all have any more comments, we will.
Thanks for letting us rant.
We're here for you.
I'd stay here and rant all night if I'm just trying to keep my mouth shut. This is great. So.
We hope we also inspired people to go look. There's a lot of negativity in this topic, but the flip side we also tried to hit at is this is also a fascinating topic. Seeing 2 million blackbirds is one of the coolest things we've ever seen. Seeing hundreds of trumpeter swans, bigger than any, seeing hundreds of white turkeys fly overhead is mesmerizing. Go find it, go enjoy them. Use these as a hook to get new people interested, because new birders are really intimidated by obscure warblers, but they freaking love 2 million blackbirds. They love swans, they love geese. Use that as a hook to get people involved. You can do a lot of good by paying attention to birds in big numbers. That's the happy takeaway message is go enjoy this stuff. Drive through Columbia. Next time you drive through Columbia to see a bunch of starlings in a cell tower, stop and look at them. Don't just roll your eyes. Watch the murmuration. It's amazing.
Hear, hear. That seems like a good way to end on a super positive note. So thank you both so very much. This has been absolutely wonderful. And we will talk to you soon. And folks in the audience, we will be sending follow-up info. And it looks like Joanna already posted some on the MoBirds listserv, but you'll be getting emails from MRBO as well. So thank you all.